Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, here we go.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the monthly Conexxus webinar series. Today, our webinar is on PCI and small merchant compliance and what does the future hold. Our presenter today is Chris Bucalo from ControlScan. Our agenda, I'll go over a few housekeeping items. I'll talk a little bit more about Chris and his background and what makes him a subject matter expert in PCI and small merchants. A little bit about Conexxus. Chris will go through the presentation, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. Just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and it will be made available in approximately 30 days. And on your screen, you should be able to see the YouTube channel, and you can always subscribe to Conexxus online, or it will also be available in the Conexxus website, which is conexxus.org. If you would like a link to obtain a copy of the slide deck, we ask you to please complete the survey, which is at the end of the presentation. And there's only just a few questions at the end, so it shouldn't only take you maybe 30 seconds or to 1 minute to answer the survey questions. We do ask that you ask questions via the webinar interface, which is the webinar panel. There's a little question section, and we will answer them either in the order that they were received or pertinent to the conversation at the time. And please, we ask that you ask no vendor-specific questions. So try and keep them generic if possible. And then if you do have any questions and want more information on Conexxus or any of the other Conexxus information, please email Conexxus at info@conexxus.org. Our Conexxus host today is Miss Allie Russell, and her email address is there. My name is Kara Gunderson. I am the chair of the Conexxus Data Security Committee. During the day, my real job, I'm the point of sale manager at Citgo Petroleum. And we're very happy today to have Chris Bucalo, who's the director of strategic partnerships and market strategy from ControlScan with us. Chris is a professional payment card industry person, and he is also a member of the Conexxus Data Security Standards Committee. We also have a subcommittee comprised of subject matter experts that create security guidance for all of the Conexxus standards and use cases and implementation guides. Chris is also a member of the National Automatic Merchandising Association Data Security Standards Committee. He is also on the PCI Security Standards Council Small Merchant Task Force. He is on the Merchant Acquirers Committee, Education Committee. And as you can tell from his very smooth delivery today, he is a frequent speaker and writer. Chris has over 30 years experience in the financial, technology, and security and compliance industries. In his current role at ControlScan, Chris is responsible for helping our partners maximize their partner relationships with value-added security offerings and simplified PCI compliance processes. Previously, he managed business development for our security consulting and security engineering services. Chris possesses a wealth of knowledge in the payment security best practices and merchant relationships, having built and sold his own ISO organization, which was one of the first in the country to embrace PCI security standards, and they include related services among core merchant offerings. So Chris is excited to talk with you today about the findings from the ControlScan and the Merchant Acquirers Committee 2018 Acquiring Trends Survey. There's a lot of data to present, so we will take turns presenting throughout the discussion today. A little bit about Conexxus before we get started. Conexxus is an independent, nonprofit, member-driven technology organization. Like, for instance, Chris and I are both volunteers, and they only have a few staff members on board. And all the volunteers set standards that help with data exchange, security, mobile payments, loyalty, so on and so forth, so that it makes it easier for all merchants within the petroleum industry to adopt new technology trends, because not only are the merchants able to use the Conexxus standards, but so are the POS vendors and the other stakeholders within that landscape. Conexxus provides a vision to identify emerging technology and trends, and Conexxus is really an advocate for the industry because technology is really their policy. For our 2018 Conexxus webinar schedule, last month we had a great webinar by Synopsys, which focused on attacking fuel mobile payment solutions. Today, of course, we have Chris talking about PCI and small merchant compliance. March 22nd, Sam Finsteel and the Coalfire Lab folks will be conducting an actual penetration testing and how to test what matters most. In April is the Conexxus annual conference that I'll talk about in a little bit, so we usually skip a webinar that month. And then Chris is back with us in May talking about the qualified integrator reseller, the PCI program updates that are coming. And so at the end, there's a survey that asks for the topics that you'd like to see in the future. So please make sure that you're filling out the survey at the end so that we can keep the topics of interest that pertain to you most. As I mentioned, the 2018 Conexxus Annual Conference is coming up at the end of April through the beginning of May. It's going to be in Chicago. And if you'd like more about sponsorship opportunities, it is required for members. You can go to Conexxus.org. And we'd like to thank our 2018 Diamond sponsors. So now I'm going to hand it back over to Chris, and Chris, take it from here. Thanks for hosting today.
Great. Thank you, Cara, and thank you for the opportunity today. Welcome to the webinar, everybody. As Cara said, I'm going to talk about PCI, kind of where it's been and where it's going. And if this is over your lunch hour, I'll try to keep it moving. I have a lot of material. And even though it's PCI, I'll try not to give you indigestion if you already eaten your lunch during this session. But again, thanks for joining us here. As I review these topics today, my goal is to cover not only the merchant perspective, but also the service provider standpoint, and a little bit broader view of what I would call risk management for payments, which we'll talk about as we go through it. Do you know your risks? And do you know that the risks of your provider? And do you sort of know the breakdown between what you're responsible for and what your service providers are responsible for? And we'll talk a little bit about service providers being compliant and showing proof of that and that type of thing. We're talking a little bit about technology, and these technology solutions are great, but they have to be installed correctly, and you have to, again, understand the roles and responsibilities between you as a merchant and your service providers. So if we just take a quick look back, and I promise this will be brief, but just where PCI came from, it's 14 years since the standard was created, and just over 10 since the PCI Council has been was created to oversee PCI. And again, just the standards, the card brands actually do the enforcement. So you really have the solution itself, which is the application and the hardware, and then you have the end user environment, which is typically the merchant, and that includes any service provider that that merchant might be relying on for part of their security of the card data. So this is really still in place today, but with a whole new twist, because we've had all this focus on software development, on user buying experiences, driving more of this with the chip card, really ushering that in, and we'll talk about that. But for many years, the payment applications on consumer devices like tablets and iPhones have not been eligible for validation because of the concerns about inherent security within those devices. So the council left the markets to sort of determine what is secure and what security mechanisms are best. So this has really come full circle. Yes?
Sorry, they're having difficulty hearing us, and we're getting a lot of feedback that nobody can hear us. So we're,
really?
Yes.
Okay.
And
I can switch over to my computer and see if that works. The phone line seems fine, but maybe, do you want me to switch over to my computer and see if that helps?
Okay, now some people are saying that they can hear us just fine. Okay, okay. All right, sorry for the interruption. Okay.
Yeah, no, if that happens again, let me know. I'm getting no feedback on mine, but please let me know.
Okay, we're getting folks saying that they can hear us now. Okay, we apologize for the technical difficulties. Sorry, Chris, please continue.
Oh, no problem. So as I mentioned, we've come full circle on this, which we're going to talk about. And please keep these three elements in mind as we go through the rest of the presentation. All right, so where does it stand today? If you ask the PCI Council, they'll tell you it's a mature standard, that it's, the basics are there, the foundational pieces are there and not changing much. No more 3-year cycles on SAQ forms, self-assessment questionnaires. Basically what we're getting is tweaks and updates based on what they're finding with breach data, breach studies, and a lot of this is around service providers and remote access, at least in the United States right now. The software explosion that I talked about, you've got the Ubers of the world that, yeah, they're not payments companies, they're transportation. It's a transportation company, but without the payments integrated in, where would they be? And we've got thousands of solutions coming out like that. And then we have the e-commerce concerns. Every country that has migrated to chip card, EMV, has experienced a big increase in e-commerce fraud as they get their handle on the retail side. Talk a little bit more about that. So addressing this explosion, the United States obviously has been slow to move to chip card, but we're making progress. We're going to talk about that, and that is picking up speed now. So I always like to talk about, well, how did we get here? And it's always, in our business with PCI and security, it's always about breaches. And that's created these requirements. Just a few words about service providers, because this is such a crucial part of card-present, point-of-sale related breaches these days. So anybody that's a third party, no matter what their service or purpose is, they could be impacting the security of the data unless their activities are totally isolated from the cardholder data environment. So think target breach. We know they came in under the HVAC system to deal with that, but they pivoted over to the cardholder data environment. So we have things like tank monitoring, video surveillance, back office PC and software. And the question that you need to look at is, has that service provider, if they are in scope for PCI, have they validated, and do you indeed have proof of that, so you know that that situation is secure as it can be? And again, this is just to show you that there is really a broad reach of service provider breaches. It is the #1 issue going on in the United States, and it does happen from the company itself too. Their own access remotely within their company can also be the source of the breach, but a lot of it's focused on remote access with service providers, where they're getting in either directly into the cardholder data environment if they're a POS provider, or they're pivoting over to that in a flat network where they're doing some other service to get in. How does this really happen? Well, I'm not picking on LogMeIn here, by the way, and showing a screen here with a LogMeIn dashboard. They just happen to be one of many remote access providers. But this is almost always starting with a phishing email, picking out a service provider, finding out some information about who's who, sending an email and a phishing email, and capturing the credentials of the person at the service provider. Again, this could be happening internally, but it's often also a service provider. And once they have access to the LogMeIn dashboard of that service provider, they can see merchants, and in this case, they might see dozens. And that's where the efficiency of their attack comes in. That's where the jackpot is, if you will. They can enter the merchant environment, especially if the remote access is turned on and left on in always listening mode. They take over the merchant desktop, gain control of the admin functions, and literally in less than a few minutes, they can drag executable files from that merchant system that contain cardholder data. And often it is months until that merchant knows, because they have been flagged on the common point of purchase system by Visa or one of the card brands. So this is often how this is playing out in the US today. And again, remember, it's the basis for a lot of the requirements that get updated from the PCI Council and the card brand. So next we want to look at what is the PCI Council and card brand response to what we're talking about. And I think most people are probably aware at this point that over the last few years, it became very clear from the PCI Council, that you must achieve compliance annually, and you must validate that compliance. Normally, that is through a self-assessment questionnaire. If you have a certain volume, you would be required to go get a QSA, a Qualified Security Assessor, to come out and do an on-site assessment and provide what's called a ROC, a Report of Compliance. Most merchants can qualify for the self-assessment questionnaire. And the other thing that went into effect last year was this issue that if you have a point-of-sale system and there's an installation or integration and or support by a third party of that point-of-sale system, and it involves a validated payment application, we'll talk a bit more about that, but you remember that from the earlier slide. A validated payment application, they should be using a QIR, a qualified integrator and reseller. And again, QIR, we'll talk a little bit more about as we go forward here. But as far as what this created then, I'm just going to highlight that a few of these, because the ratcheting up of pressure for compliance and stronger security from your service providers is what you're seeing here. And I did not include all of them, but most of them are here. And the two I wanted to call out for today's discussion are the two that are bolded. It was already a requirement that if your service provider does remote access into your CDE, which is just cardholder data environment, if they were doing that, it was already required to have security for remote access. But now, which is multi-factor authentication. But now even for within your own company, you're supposed to have multi-factor authentication in place for administrative access to the cardholder data environment. And your service providers are supposed to now, as of February, they're supposed to be showing that they're doing penetration tests for network segmentation every 6 months. And all that really means is that they're showing that the system is isolated, that it is not a flat network that can go from one network segment to another, that they are isolated. And we'll talk in a few minutes about practical ways to make sure that isolation does take place. But this is definitely something that's going to continue to get focused. You can see here just under the penetration test bullet there on 12.4.1, executive management. And that is where this is going, is that it's getting more and more important that the C-level executives be involved in understanding the requirements and making sure they're executed from a service provider standpoint. So quarterly reviews, all those type of things are here, that these are now required of your service providers. So I know everybody has different level of access and information, but I just wanted to cover just briefly multi-factor authentication. It's still sometimes a common misconception that username and password are 2 factors when in fact they're just one. Something you know, something you have, and something you are. Biometrics is clearly exploding, and we don't have really time to go into that today and talk about the pros and cons, but suffice it to say, and you've seen this with phones and other things, that there are a number of ways now that biometrics are being used as a factor of authentication, and that will continue to grow. I've even seen one where they have the ability to put the biometric fingerprint reading right onto the credit card itself. So there's definitely a lot going on in that area. But multi-factor has taken on, extremely increased importance. This is one I wanted to cover because when you come into this payments world and people talk about scanning and penetration testing, I think it gets a little fuzzy, and it naturally so. It's understandable. So I like to use the medical analogy here, that anything that's internet facing certainly needs to be scanned. And I think most people do have a pretty good handle on that. And what is a scan really? I think of it like an MRI. It's scanning, looking for open ports. It's looking for whether software is updated. It's basically scanning the system to see if there are signs of trouble, signs of vulnerability that could be further explored. Penetration testing is what I would consider more exploratory surgery, and it involves an ethical hacker, basically, who plans an attack on an environment to see what vulnerabilities are really there in depth. And as part of that, they do use scanning, and that's one of the ways it gets confused. They have to do a discovery process and a mapping. They actually map to make sure the network that you tell them you have is what they actually see. And that's how they plan their attack. So penetration testing is much more in depth. It's done primarily by a human, although there is a certain percentage that's automated. But that is the view of penetration testing, and hopefully there's a little bit of humor in it over there on the right, but I'll keep moving regardless of whether you think so or not. So let's talk for a minute about qualified integrators and resellers. This program has been around for a while, but it's had trouble gaining like massive traction, if you will. It's gotten more traction and more attention recently, but incorrect installation or maintenance of systems is definitely an issue. And certainly if you're supporting it and you're supporting these applications and you're doing it remotely, that's also a concern. Today, it is required for validated payment applications. Again, ones that have gone through that scrutiny and have been approved by the PCI Council to create in a payment device. And we're going to talk about where this is heading in a slide a little bit down the road here. If you do have your own in-house technicians, they don't have to be QIRs, but there is a benefit to it, to going out and going through that program. It's not overly expensive, so you could have them go through that program and really understand best practices. So that would be my recommendation. And again, just some clarification points that Visa came out with a while ago, that if a vendor, it doesn't apply if a vendor supporting an ancillary application that's properly segmented. Again, this segmentation or isolation from the cardholder data activity is important. Or if they're putting out there, let's say, a standalone plug-and-play device like a Verifone or Ingenico or one of those, and it doesn't allow for remote access, that's not a QIR scenario as well. But again, this is something to keep in mind because we're going to talk about updates that are coming to this program in the near future. All right, so I'm going to, I put this in here because I used to do work with a forensic auditor in this business, payment forensic investigator, and he did a lot of investigations that involved this scenario with the service provider and remote access. And I always found that this set of guidelines was really great to have, to keep and refer to. And so it will be available, we'll make it available on the WeCare site. So this is a tool that you'll have. And some people ask me, well, Chris, how does this remote access work with enabling it only when needed? Are there vendors out there that offer that? And the answer is yes. There's vendors like TeamViewer and BombGuard and some others who do have the ability to give you that where it is turned on and off as needed with human intervention as needed at the merchant level rather than having it be in always listening mode. So given all that, again, now we're looking at the merchant perspective, primarily the small merchant perspective. What's the best approach? So first and foremost, again, if you have transaction volumes that do not necessitate working with a QSA, Qualified Security Assessor, directly, and you can do your own self-assessment questionnaire, I would always advise enrolling in a PCI program where you can go online, use a web portal, get access to support people who can provide you support typically by phone or email or chat. And then there's a lot of times the questions are either reworded in better English, so to speak, less techy, and or they have help text that helps explain the questions. So I would advise wherever possible to use a system like that, and there are plenty of vendors in the marketplace that do that. And then I would say if you're looking at a vendor for PCI and you're looking at what are the issues, one of the biggest issues is getting to the right SAQ to start. And this is sort of where the rubber hits the road, if you will, in this industry, is merchants getting to the wrong SAQ and then having to back out, or they've actually completed it and they find out that they've done the wrong SAQ, and that's not a happy time when that happens, of course. One of the things I would also say to look at is, are they allowing you to do multiple processing methods under one SAQ? So obviously most folks in the world have multiple processing methods, and the Petro space is no different. You would have multiple processing scenarios, and it would be best if you could go through one SAQ unless your card processor required something else. You should be able to do multiple processing methods on one SAQ form where it takes into account the requirements of both. There are some cases where, say, you had a chain, let's say you had a chain of 10 locations, and 5 were set up a certain way, and 5 were using completely different equipment and completely different systems. Maybe in that case it might make sense to do 2 SAQs, one for the 5 with one setup and another for the 5 with the other. But you can talk through that with your card processor and whatever PCI vendor you would end up working with. But this is really a key to having the process work the way it should to make sure you're using the right form and getting secure. The other thing in the world of today that we're seeing is this movement towards, okay, I'm in SAQ, whichever is appropriate, but I need help with some of the requirements. I don't know enough about some of these things, or I don't think I have some of these services in place. I need more information about those services, and in some cases, maybe even information as to how to get those services if I don't have them myself. So maybe these are things somebody's getting through other third parties. That's great. But what some companies are doing is when you're going through the SAQ online, in line during that process, they're showing you what requirements there are and then what security services might match up to those requirements. And here's a quick example for you, just a basic example of what I mean by that is if you've got, if you've signed up for a UTM, Unified Threat Management Firewall, then whoever the MSSP, which is just the Managed Security Service Provider, assumes responsibility for the PCI requirements that are linked to that. So the firewall addresses 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3, and even better, the management of that firewall is by this third party who you've basically outsourced the responsibility and the risk to. So we want to be sure that service provider is compliant, and you also understand what they're covering and what you're still responsible for with your PCI compliance. And again, in the retail petroleum world, this would be a typical firewall design, and one of the issues we understand is cost. That, you know, in lieu of having 2 internet connections to have isolation, to achieve isolation, a firewall is a perfectly adequate way of creating that separation of cardholder data environment from non-cardholder data environment. It can also support things like that are not cardholder data related, like Wi-Fi and things like that, depending on the setup. So what you're looking for it to do, though, is the activity logging, monitoring, tracking, and of course, system alerting as well. So a properly configured firewall can help achieve PCI compliance and reduce the risk in terms of what you're responsible for. And this leads to, this is a bit old of a slide, but I love this slide because it really shows the progression from left to right about what Visa has talked about so much over the last few years as network segmentation. And, you know, flat network on the left, all the way up to the highest and best, which you see there called air-gapped. Well, air-gapped simply means you've got 2 railroad tracks and they never meet. And that can be costly. So under the medium solution, we're looking at firewalls separating the cardholder data environment from the rest of the network. And the rules and keeping those rules up to date are important, of course. So that's a good example of how firewalls come into play in terms of where they sit on the spectrum. But in your world, tampering and skimming has taken on added importance, which I think everybody's pretty aware of that. You know, because the unattended environment in particular may be open and accessible to vendors even, it's important that access privileges with your vendors are well defined, and that access and actions are logged. You know, do you have a plan to monitor vendors' activities when they have physical access to payment devices? Keep in mind it may involve situations where vendors are working on aspects of your business that aren't related to payments, like a networked printer, for one example, behind the counter. Inside the store, are payment terminals kept out of customers' reach? Do you have a procedure in place to check the security of your payment devices before closing every day? And just a few notes of, you know, the obvious signs of tampering, things like broken seals on cover plates or screws, different cables in place, new add-on devices, replacement devices, or features you just don't recognize. So maintaining a list and inventory of, and with photographs of your payment devices, as well as the list of vendors authorized to work on those devices, is really important. So then we can't stress enough the human element. And if you've read anything about breaches recently, over the last year, you've probably seen a lot about that. I know when Verizon puts out their annual data breach study, and some other folks do that as well, there's been an increased focus on the human element. And I mentioned the phishing email earlier. That phishing is certainly one of the big ways that people are getting tricked. And realistically, the fraudsters are getting better. They've gotten very sophisticated, and they're getting better at fooling and spoofing. It's not that hard to spoof that you are contacting someone from your own company, from your own IT department, and have it look real, or the HR department. So it always comes back to the same things: passwords, strength, remote access. Again, if human intervention can be part of that remote access, it It's really effective, but just keep an understanding that it can cut in both directions when you give remote access to people. Social engineering, I already mentioned. And I have to say, being a skeptic when that repairman shows up or whatever, that call, that email, whatever, being a skeptic is the order of the day, even if sometimes people get ruffled. But I'm not suggesting we ruffle our customers' feathers, of course, but there are situations that come up. I know we still have a landline at home, which probably isn't a good idea anymore in some ways. But with that landline, I'm starting to feel sorry for people that call here and try to get information from me because I've become such a skeptic. And I think that's the order of the day. All right. So now that we've talked a little bit about where we've been and how we got here today and what we're focused on, I'd like to spend the rest of the time, there should be time at the end for questions. I'd like to spend the rest of the time talking about where is PCI heading and where these trends are going. So you might, people say to me all the time, Chris, wasn't EMV supposed to fix all this? Well, up to a degree, yes. So we've got, EMV is great. It's great security for the card itself, authenticating the card holder and that the card is valid. That's great. But today, we only have EMV in about 50–55% of merchant outlets. There's still a lot of magstripe out there and magstripe data. The other thing is that if EMV is not coupled with a fully end-to-end process like point-to-point encryption or end-to-end encryption, there is data that can be transmitted in clear text through the random access memory of the point-of-sale system. So when somebody says a system is encrypted, the question is it encrypted end-to-end? And does only one player at the other end of the process have access to the encryption keys to encrypt and decrypt data, or do others have access to it? So it has to be a fully end-to-end system to prevent some of the fraud that's still out there. And again, this is through the point-of-sale environment mostly. So there's a lot of magstripe data out there that allows for the replication of cards in the dark web. So until we get to the point where we've got most EMV, most merchants are EMV compliant, and we've got all cards are EMV capable, and we have all that flowing, then hopefully at some point they can eliminate these mag stripes, which basically are, as most of us know, very old technology. So just a word too, we will suggest that understanding outside at the fuel pumps that you've got until 2020. We understand there's also a bit of a waiting game about point-to-point encryption. There's no current indication that the card brands will mandate point-to-point encryption, but we do recommend that you not wait till then. Early adoption of the outdoor technology for EMV allows you to drive more business and reduce fraud. Certainly with the young buyers, it's all about low friction or no friction and convenience, and meeting the expectations of those folks and getting in this game of supporting the mobile and contactless transactions, which are on the rise, getting EMV in place. That technology makes all of that possible. So we do have information. There is information from Conexxus on the WeCare site on this as well. So that is something to take a look at. So I thought that was worth spending a few minutes on. As far as where PCI is heading, a couple things to look for here. I mentioned QIR, again, qualified integrators and resellers. It is our understanding in March of this year, next month, that they will announce a more streamlined QIR program, and it'll be focused on the big three: remote access, password strength, and software updates, software patching, all the good stuff we always hear about. But it will also, we understand, no longer require that it be a validated payment application. And that will really open it up. So think of it as the program will get broader in what it applies to, but narrower in the requirements that it's focused on. So again, it'll bring in more software applications into view and into assessment, but at the same time, it will require less things of the QIR to focus on the big three, as I mentioned. So more focus on that. Again, more emphasis on e-commerce, and the reason, as I mentioned, is that's the natural order of things. When a country shifts to EMV, we see a lot of increase in e-commerce breach risk. The hosted models have held up really well, but if somebody's hosting their own, that's where the risk is highest these days. We'll also see more emphasis on technology like point-to-point encryption. Now, keep in mind, the card brands they're not dictating anything on that. In fact, they're currently gathering data on how much penetration is out there on point-to-point encryption, and they're going to talk about the best ways to promote that. And as you'll see in a minute, it is the gold standard. But you know, it's not all pluses. There's always pluses and minuses to everything. The other thing is we're going to cover a few slides on this PCI Small Merchant Task Force that I'm part of, and there is an effort to come out with an alternative to SAQs, and that will be this year, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that entails. So just a few more things, because I want to leave time for questions, but it's a call to action in the marketplace. The merchants are saying, you know, PCI in some ways has gotten more complex, not less, with some of the requirements that came out of these breach issues. The card processors are saying, that's great, but how do you achieve strong security at the same time? And from our standpoint, being in compliance and security, we want both, and we want it to be a win-win. So our view is that authentic compliance, meaning you don't just check the boxes, but you do pay attention to the concepts, and wherever possible, outsource security or use technology that reduces scope and risk, and that's part of a good risk management strategy. And I would say the number one need, because of all the confusion and all the myriad of options out there, is to find a trusted advisor who's going to help you see what's the right services at the right cost at the right time, and not just to make something a sale, but to be consultative. And you don't need overkill. You need what you need within a reasonable budget. So just a note about semi-integrated models. This is a really hot area in the market, reducing scope and reducing risk by basically shifting the processing over to that standalone terminal device you see over here. Although it is connected, I shouldn't call it standalone, it is connected to the electronic cash register. The only processing and handling of credit card data is occurring through that separate payment terminal. This allows you to shift away from the point of sale system. It makes EMV compliance easier to achieve. A lot of times you can do that without a large investment, and it allows you to get into this cardholder-driven, buyers focus where they want to control the transaction. They want it to be quick. So that's something. It's connected. So a QSA company like ours would not say there's no risk, but we would say there's low risk to a situation like that. And that is really one of the trends we're seeing in the marketplace is semi-integrated model, again, to reduce risk and to reduce scope. Probably you've heard more about this area, which is point-to-point encryption versus end-to-end encryption. And, nothing like a lot of acronyms to make things confusing, but just to try to demystify it a little bit today, point-to-point encryption is a validated thing that you can get through the PCI Council. There are QSAs that do assessments for this. It's ideal from a security standpoint. It's the gold standard. But up front, there is a certain cost to it, And you have less control when you have it in place, because anything you change on a point-to-point encryption scenario is not a light bulb. It's rewiring. So today we've had a lot of resurgence of end-to-end encryption with tokenization. Voltage was an early mover in that space, and there are others. The Counsel, PCI Counsel, does have an assessment program for this now. And again, if you ask our QSA, he'll tell you that these can be very effective, and in some cases allow for more control and flexibility. So your situation is unique. Again, the key is getting those trusted advisors so you get the right help. And just a word about this, as I mentioned to you about this coming full circle. Here's your full circle on consumer devices, right? So there's new guidance out now from the Council on software being used on consumer devices like your iPhone or tablet when PIN entry is involved. And there's now an evaluation methodology. They're not saying one is good and one isn't, but they're giving an evaluation methodology. This is so far in the attended environment. And in addition, they have come out with new security standards for EMV for what's called 3D Secure. Basically, when you're looking again at buyers, especially young buyers, they want to use those mobile applications. They don't want friction. And the old methods for authenticating e-commerce transactions on web browsers and mobile applications did create a lot of friction, and a lot of consumers weren't happy with it. So this is a big move and shows you it'll just keep moving in this direction towards convenience and low friction for security. And by the way, from a demographic standpoint, I don't think that millennials in general and the younger groups, even younger than them, have a problem with security as long as it doesn't slow them down. And that's what we've seen in the studies that we've looked at. So just a word about what we're doing with the Small Merchant Task Force. This first slide I have labeled, the numbers don't lie. Yeah, it's been around, but this is still true, whether it's because they assume the defenses are less or just because of the way they can do things through the service provider. There's definitely been a big focus on small business being breached at a pretty high rate in this country. But what we've done on the task force over the last few years is looked at creating simpler ways of understanding a security concept. So our initial release, the work was really good in my opinion, but it wasn't married to the SAQ process. So basically you're saying to a small merchant, here's a lot of good tools and information, but it doesn't marry to your SAQ. You still have to do an SAQ. The best thing that came out, in my opinion, of our initial efforts was that we put processing methods into risk categories. And then when we put them into risk categories, we said these are the threats that are most likely associated with that category, like point of sale versus standalone device. And then here are the ways you can mitigate those. And that's the basis for what we're doing now. Later this year, hopefully as early as April, we will be releasing data security essentials for what we would call low to medium risk scenarios. Meaning in certain high risk scenarios, we still think an SAQ is appropriate, but we are going to let the acquirers, card brands out there, make a determination if they want to offer those as alternatives to SAQs. So what does it really mean? We do more consolidation of the concepts that are required into fewer questions. Every effort to simplify is made, and more explanation as backup. And again, there's this risk focus. So I just want to briefly show you that there are two concepts we have here. The one is a low risk or lower risk scenario with a dial-up terminal and internet connected cash register. You can see they're not connected to each other, so the risk is limited. It's only in this device, and we show you what threats you have. This is all online, by the way, on the PCI Council website. What I'm showing you here is all public information. It's all online today through their small business resource area. And then this higher risk scenario, just shows you how the complexity goes way up when you have an electronic cash register system and you've got the potential for things like malware. So things escalate, and so the risk is higher, and there's more issues about what you can do to mitigate. So I never like to end any presentation without some kind of a takeaway list. And this is what I have for you guys today. PCI is here to stay. For small business, many times PCI really is the only, or the best and only exposure they have to security concepts and security knowledge. And in a lot of cases, it is true that it's not too expensive. But the key is, again, getting those trusted advisors. The typical vulnerabilities, the first three are under asterisk there because that's that new QIR focus I mentioned, the big three. And this will continue to be stressed until this problem, is largely mitigated, and over time it will be. Firewalls with established rules, physical fraud with skimmers and pin pad overlays, and then, can't stress it enough, the human element. Security awareness training, testing, that kind of thing, testing your employees is really crucial. So, not surprising, the PCI Council keeps talking about the same three. Okay, remote access, passwords, software, and the like. So with that, I know I've taken a lot of time, so I wanted to see if there was some questions, Cara, that I could turn over to you.
Yes, Chris, thank you very much for that information. I know that we've had several drop-off, unfortunately, due to the technical audio difficulties that we're experiencing today. Thankfully, not everybody is having those difficulties. So, and a few questions did come in. One person has indicated that they've done PCI compliance for their debit and credit cards, and now they're being asked to do it from yet another acquirer that manages their like telecheck machines. And so I think the short story here is that they're being asked to validate PCI compliance by a couple of different resources. What is the best rule of thumb and where to go? Because certainly we know that they should be communicating things between their processors. But what is your recommendation?
Well, my recommendation is to, number one, confirm that that secondary element is in scope. And once that's confirmed, I would suggest that they, with whichever PCI vendor process they're using, they cover it all in that one process. And then if that credit card processor has a requirement that they show proof, even through another online vendor, they can provide that paperwork from vendor A that would get put on the system of vendor B. So they would show up as being compliant on both credit card processors' PCI compliance vendor systems. I know that was a mouthful. I'd be happy to follow up and explain that better. But there is an offline compliance process you can follow to just basically enter documentation on what you did on vendor A and put it on the system of vendor B. So I'll be happy to explain that more if needed.
Okay, thank you. Going back to the information on QIR, which is basically that the technicians have to have a PCI QIR certification to be able to work on point-of-sale units, and so the question is, does PCI require a merchant to obtain PCI compliance certificate from vendors that work on equipment such as fuel dispensers, where there is a card reader and pin pads where they are accepting payments? So, there's a couple schools of thought there and ways that I could interpret that question. Number one is, is QIR required for that technician? And number two, would they go so far as to possibly even ask for their PCI DSS attestation of compliance?
Yeah. So, I mean, the QIR going through the process is only required if they're doing it for third parties. If they're doing it internally and they're employees of that company, then no, they don't need to have, they're not required to have the QIR. we're suggesting, and I know you agree with this, we're suggesting that they get that, but it's not required.
Correct. Yeah, because then they have a better understanding of PCI, the network, and things like that. Where typically in the petroleum world, we haven't had to have that level of expertise until as of late.
Exactly. And if that QIR is a part of a separate company that's a service provider of any kind that may be in scope in that they can impact the security, then yes, you should be asking them, have you gone through a service provider assessment process, either self-assessment or a QSA-led assessment? If so, can you show me the proof that you achieve compliance?
Yeah, and I think too that reaching out to your own qualified security assessor is probably a good rule of thumb, because you don't want to get to the point in your annual audit or assessment and then go, oh shoot, we didn't collect this information, or service providers didn't want this because now our QSA is requiring this. And so I think that there's going to be that element in there. And also there's the PCI Security Standards Council document on third-party security assurance, which really outlines what sort of the basics of some great flow charts in that as well. That's the third-party security assurance document.
That's right. So people don't read it because it's so long, but it has a great appendix at the end. And in that appendix is what I always like to talk about. There's the matrix of the breakdown of roles and responsibilities between you and your service providers.
Correct. Also, another question is, how does the point-to-point encryption solution affect the requirements for the managed firewall relative to integrated point-of-sale systems?
Yeah, so from a PCI perspective, the use of the point-to-point encryption takes out of requirement most of the elements that a managed firewall covers. So, but from a security standpoint, a lot of people would tell you, especially given that a firewall can do more than just handle the payment activity and payment isolation, that there are merits to that, in addition to point-to-point encryption. Some people are making the decision one versus the other, and you have to look at costs and the benefits and all that. Others are looking at it like, well, yeah, my point-to-point encryption keeps this the lowest scope and lowest risk possible, but the firewall gives me other benefits as well. So it depends on your environment, but there is some companies that can do a good job of helping you determine a return on investment and the best practices for that.
Sure, and there are even firewall companies out there that will contractually take responsibility for some of the firewall sections relative to the merchant's PCI as well. So those would be some additional questions to be asking, I think.
Exactly.
Do you have any examples of the impact of data breaches on small businesses? I know that you were showing some examples, and I think that some of the small business information that is in the PCI website does have some statistics relative to the impact on small business from a financial perspective.
Yeah, there's a lot of gloom and doom out there too, but there's not a lot of good data about small merchant breaches when it comes to that. We have a certain access to information because of being involved in offering breach coverage. It's not insurance per se, but it reimburses you expenses if a breach occurs. So the average level 4 merchant, which is basically anybody doing less than $1 million, 1 million transactions per card brand per year, the average breach, typically, if it's only a single location or 2 locations, is usually 100,000 or less. But 80 to 100,000 probably be a pretty good thumbnail to estimate if you had to look at what's been out there in the last year or so.
So if you look at that statistic and you think, geez, I can't take the time, or I can't afford to do PCI, I think there's a lot of affordable programs out there that can help people accomplish the majority of their PCI compliance, or at least, like you'd outlined, the top priorities, and that's the same thing that the Conexxus and NACS We Care program does as well. It's the big stuff, right? Some of the big stuff that you can knock out. So.
Yeah, and there's, if you're in a PCI program, you might find you can get breach coverage. You might also find that it's worth checking into cybersecurity coverage as a rider on your commercial policy. That market has changed quite a bit, and in that realm, it is true insurance, and you do have to prove that you're following things that are required for PCI and security. So a little bit different, but those things are all out there as part of a good risk management way of dealing with this, which is how I like to look at it.
Sure. With Visa having signatures going away in April of this year, do you see a future change on issuers with debit cards going to chip and pin transactions?
Well, I'm only chuckling because this is a tough one for me. I think everything should be chip and pin. That's my view, to help get rid of the risk and get away from these mag stripes altogether. And signature, I think it is good to get rid of the signature requirement. I don't think it's being used barely at all, and so it creates friction without any benefits, without any real benefits. I'm 100% in favor of PIN, but I can't tell. The U.S. market is so fragmented, and there's so little agreement on things like this, and a whole lot of other things, of course, but hard to say. One big issuer has to do it, and if one big issuer does it, then I think others will follow.
I agree. The next question is, how do you find or define quote-unquote trusted advisors?
Okay, so this part's hard not to be a homer for my own company, but I say that most people go to their credit card processor first for anything related to credit card processing, and that is a good place to start. And ask them, who do you use? Who do you recommend we use if you haven't already told me for PCI? And PCI, again, as you remember, I think should be the foundation only. And then find out if that PCI provider also provides security services and how you might match those up where it's appropriate. Can you get things from just a few trusted sources rather than wheeling around in the marketplace and whirling around trying to find something when they all sound different but similar in some ways? And so that's where I would start. Card processor, who's their PCI vendor, and I would start with that. Also, if you have an IT provider that you trust, I would go to them as well.
Thank you. And then we have one last question, and I know we've gone over the time limit, so we appreciate a lot of people still hanging in there. How is tokenization viewed in the PCI community? Is it really end-to-end encryption, or is that classified as something else?
Yeah, no, great point. So, initially, end-to-end encryption was used to, data in motion, and tokenization was typically only used for data at rest, data in a database. But things have evolved, and the use of phones, has created an environment where tokens are used more broadly. I'm not an expert on all the technical aspects of that. I wish I was, but I'm not. But I can tell you that tokenization has taken on added importance. It is viewed positively. I can tell you that companies like Voltage that came out early with those solutions did very well. And when you ask a QSA to look at end-to-end encryption and tokenization together, they'll start asking questions about who has access to the keys and who has access to what. But generally, it's viewed very positively in terms of scope reduction and risk.
Great. Well, Chris, you shared a lot of great information with us today. We have no further questions, and again, please complete the survey at the end of this webinar. It's just a short survey, and then you'll be sent a link to the actual presentation deck. And the recording will be posted on YouTube under the Conexxus channel in about 30 days, or also under Conexxus.org's website. So thanks, everybody. We hope you have a great day. And Chris, thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.